Alrighty. uh, we're going to do now the fourth lecture in chapter 2. This is one of my favorite lectures. All right, research ethics. Why is it a favorite lecture? Well, it's an issue that I have some strong views on. Borderline activist views, not borderline, over borderline activist views. And so this is always my chance to mess with you guys' heads a little bit. We'll get there, but I'm going to use this as a chance to first talk to you a little bit about the ethical principles that govern how we do research, and then I'm going to use it as a chance to sort of engage some critical thinking, to talk about whether the rules make sense at some level. Okay, so let's get there. Starting here. So, I mean, the first thing to realize, and there's the Tuskegee syphilis experiment is described in the textbook as a shockingly horrible, unethical research project. There have been unethical research projects done for a long time. I always found this one kind of, I mean, it's humorous, but it's not humorous when you think about it. So Edward Jenner, he observed that milkmaids did not get smallpox. So at a time when smallpox was ravaging people, hey, we know what it's like to be in a sort of pandemic situation. This guy just happened to notice that the women who deliver the milk and milk the actual cows to get the milkmaids that milk the cows to get the milk, they didn't seem to get smallpox. And so Edward thought that, hey, maybe exposure to cowpox. So cows have a version of smallpox. And his theory was that milkmaids, because they're in such close interaction with the cows, maybe are getting cowpox, which could almost be like a vaccine of a sort from smallpox, that once you get cowpox, maybe it protects you from smallpox. Okay, everything fine so far. Now, how did he actually test this? Well, this is kind of gross, but he would inject pus from a cowpox blister into a child. So he was literally infecting children with cowpox, the bovine, which means cow, the bovine version of smallpox. And then later, he exposed the child to smallpox. And the question was, did that help them, right? So in this cartoon, inspired by the vaccine controversy, you can't necessarily read it because it's a little messed up, but Edward Jenner administers cowpox vaccine to frightened young women and cows emerging from different parts of people's bodies. The inoculation agent cowpox vaccine was rumored to have the ability to sprout cow-like appendages. So the notion is if you had this cowpox vaccine, you were suddenly going to start having cow bits come from you. This fear at the time. I mean, this sort of research, right? We don't want people just doing stuff like this, just infecting people with diseases. Now, I mean, this is sort of what we do, right? I mean, to some extent, the reason I choose this example is we have gotten to a point where when we talk about vaccine trials, this is what we're doing. Now, we're not giving people a disease. I mean, with a vaccine, you're sometimes stimulating. You have a little bit of that disease thing, enough to get the immune system up, but it's very careful. It's very controlled, and it's very overseen. But yeah, we might vaccinate people, and then they would be naturally exposed to the disease. Like in our case, it could be COVID, and we could ask to the people who were vaccinated catch the disease at a lower rate. So we do something sort of like this, but Edward Jenner was just doing it. He didn't necessarily have a whole lot of science behind it. He just thought this seemed like a good idea, and he was injecting people with cowpox. Okay, so this just to say, these sorts of things have been around for a while. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment that you'll hear about was a particularly horrific example that, along with other examples from psychology, the Stanford prison experiment is a big one, and the Milgram experiment you'll read about authority. Those experiments really kind of pushed the psychological community to feel like, okay, we can't just let people run loose and do whatever they want. They have to follow certain rules. And here are the rules. Now, before I talk about the rules, let me just tell you about how are these enforced? What good are rules if you can't enforce them? The way things work, let me just give you the Canadian example, but it's pretty similar around the world, is researchers like me, like every faculty member at U of T, if they want to perform research, they typically apply to an agency to get some grant support for their research. And that allows them to cover students, graduate students, materials they may need, computers, etc. But the rule of that grant is you only get those funds if you agree to play by these rules for every research project that you do. And part of that means before you even do the research project, you have to apply for ethics review from a so-called institutional review board, or IRB. So you basically have to tell them ahead of time, here's the experiment I'm imagining, here are the participants I want to recruit, here's how I want to recruit them, this is what they're going to go through, here's why I'm doing it in the first place, these are the potential benefits of doing this, here are the potential risks. And basically that IRB, that panel, looks at everything and considers these things, how well you are following these things, and you must get their approval before you can begin. Okay, so what are these things? So first of all, the things depend on whether the participant is a human or an animal. And that's the thing I'm going to come back to in just a moment. But when it comes to humans, here are the sort of rules you play by. Coercion. Participants cannot be forced to participate in the study. Now, you'll notice in your case, by the way, we are offering you course credit to participate in experiments. You don't know a whole lot about that yet, maybe. It's in that SONA system. We'll be talking to you about it in about a week or two, how to actually get involved in it. Actually, when you're watching this, that's probably about when we'll be talking to you. It's a week or two from when I'm recording, but that's about when you'll be reading this. So you'll soon hear about your ability to participate, and we offer you can earn up to 3% in the course by participating, 3 out of 3 by doing that. So that's not considered coercion per se, though, because we're also giving you a learning experience. We're letting you experience what research is really like, and the amount of reward isn't considered enough to really be coercive all that much. It's just a few marks. But, I could not force somebody to participate in a study. Second, informed consent. We've bumped into this a couple times in this chapter. Participants must know that they are involved in research and must give their consent or permission. Remember I talked about that one-way glass rumor at UTSC that we were watching all the students as they do? We couldn't do that. You just are not allowed to collect data on people who are unaware they are part of a study. They have to be aware. They should be told ahead of time what the sort of what's going to be asked of them in the study, what the potential risks are, if there are risks, and that's what makes them informed, right? They have to be informed about the study a little bit, and then with that information in place, they have to consent and say, yes, I agree to be part of that study. And so it's very important, the process we do to make sure participants are giving informed consent, and we just can't do research on them unless they do. Anonymity, confidentiality, the identities and actions of the participants must not be revealed. So we have to protect the privacy. We typically do this, by the way, by removing the identity of the participant as soon as we have the data. It's not really usually important to us who gave us that data. We just want a bunch of data. And if we can strip the identity away, then we know that data will never get linked to the person, and we're protecting their privacy. But we have to talk to our IRB about how we're doing all that. Risk. So there's actually, this says risk, but it's sort of risk benefit. The IRB really looks at what's the positives that can come out of this and what are the negatives. And they want to know that the positives far outweigh the negatives, right? And so generally on the negatives, you cannot be placed in a situation which is significant mental or physical risk. So we can't obviously put somebody literally, physically or mentally at a strong risk. Now, there could be negatives. There could be discomforts or embarrassments or various other things about the experience that aren't, they're not really considered a risk, but they're not the optimal experience somebody might have. Sometimes we do that. So for example, sometimes you say in experiments, subjects might be kind of bored in this experiment because they're going to be sitting here for an hour and a half doing the same task over and over. So they are going to be bored. But there's a good reason to bore them. And here's the good reason. And so the IRB looks at those two and says, does the benefit outweigh the negatives of the risks? And then the debriefing here that participants must be told the purpose of the study and provided with ways to contact the researchers about the results when the study is complete. So you're supposed to at the end, and this is supposed to especially be true of all of you guys, by the way, because your research participation is part of your course experience. And so we hope that the researcher spends some time describing to you what the study was about, what they hope to find, why they were doing it. It's your chance to kind of get behind the curtain of a research project and get to know about it a little bit better. There's another little point there, small deception. If the participants are deceived in any way, so generally we don't want to deceive. We want to be as open and honest with participants about everything. We want to respect them as much as we can in all ways. But sometimes we have to either withhold some information about what we're up to or even misrepresent, even lie, pretend we're interested in one thing when we're really interested in something else. That doesn't happen that often, but it sometimes happens. And I'll give you one example. We sometimes use, especially in social psychology, we'll use what we call confederates. Confederates are people who are pretending to be participants. So they show up maybe at the same time as you show up, and they're acting as though they are also a participant in the study, but really they're in on it. They're going to behave in certain ways, and the experimenter might be interested in how their behavior affects you. And so they're actually part of the study, but we wouldn't tell you that until the end. But then we have to tell you, okay? And so that's if we deceive, then at the end of the experiment, we have to explain, we have to fess up, by the way, we deceived you, here's why we deceived you. And we also have to, if we think that deception could cause any issues or problems, we have to have mitigation plans. We have to say, well, this is what I'm going to do if the participant's upset at that point in time. Okay, so that gives you the sense of the human guidelines. Now, I notice the textbook describes them a little bit differently, but they all kind of connect to the same points, I think. So I'm gonna leave it to you to connect those things, and if there's any confusion, bring it to office hours. We'll talk it through. The core of this, though, is that you have to respect that other human being. They are giving you data that you want, and you in turn have to treat them with a very high level of respect. And so you'll see words like fidelity in the textbook, which is sort of brotherly, like a family kind of relation towards them of a sort. Okay, so that's humans. That's when you're doing research on humans. What if you're doing research on animals? Well, it's very different rules then. First of all, you have to be justified. So here's the trick with animal research. Very often it involves or allows you to do things that you would never do to a human. And this is going to be a subject we're going to talk about in just a bit. But for example, you might be allowed to remove parts of an animal's brain. I mean, remember the neuropsychology where we said, well, with humans, you kind of have to wait for that brain part to be damaged. Well, sometimes with animals, you don't. You can do what are called ablation studies, where you actually intentionally damage part of the animal's brain to see what effect that has on behavior. You could never do that to a human, but we will allow that sort of thing, or we will allow animals to be put under stress in certain ways that we would never allow a human being. So with that in mind, these are some of the things. So first of all, there has to be a justification. You have to be able to argue, there's a reason I'm doing this to the animal. There's knowledge to be gained, and usually the idea is this, that will benefit humankind in some way. So we're doing animal research to cure diseases or whatever, and we do nasty things to them, like expose them to diseases or create animal models of the diseases because we think it will help human beings in some way. And that's our justification, right? But we have to have a justification. Care, we have to care for the animals in a very humane way, so they need their temperature controlled. Even things like sometimes handling, they need a certain amount of physical stimulation, and so people have to come in and handle the animals a little bit to give them that. You have to care for them really well. Source, you can't just go find your mice out in a field. You have to acquire the animals through legal sources, all of which has to be documented, and you have to minimize suffering. So this is that weird line where it's like, yes, we will let you do things to animals that we would not let you do to humans, but you really have to try to minimize any suffering possible. And when you just see that, minimize suffering, for me, it's like, we allow suffering? Like, forget minimize suffering. Yes, we do. Okay, so now time for a little bit of critical thought. Boom. So first of all, I am what we'll call an abolitionist. I don't think we have the right to do what we do to animals. I don't think we have the right to do anything to an animal that we wouldn't do to a human. I'm going to get back to that, but just want to contrast that. So I want to abolish animal research. Well, not totally abolish it. No, that's not actually true either. But I want a set of rules that equally applies to animals and humans. Other people are not nearly as extreme. And in fact, what I'm showing you here is sort of the dominant view in the animal research world, which is this relates to that minimized suffering. And it's called the 3 R's. And the idea is this. We want to, when it comes to animal research, first of all, if we can do it some other way, and not involve animals to reach our scientific goal, we should do that first. So we should replace animal research with other alternative approaches when we can. Reduction. We should use statistical methods that allow us to figure out how many animals do we have to do this to, and then have no more animals than that. So we really want to minimize the number of animals that get exposed to uncomfortable situations. So that's reduction. And refinement, to the extent we can improve our experiments to reduce that suffering, we want to refine our experiments with that suffering in mind. Okay. This is the dominant view, right? At universities everywhere throughout the world, they have different ethical rules applied to animal research versus human research, and they'll allow us to do things with animals that do involve suffering. Yes, we try to minimize it, but they do involve suffering. The question I like to ask you to inspire critical thought is this justified? Is there any rational reason why it's considered okay to do something to an animal that you would not do to a human being? Is this just another ism, right? So we talk about racism, treating all human beings equivalently, irrespective of their cultural background, their racial background, right? And if you treat a given race in a worse way, that's called racism, right? Sexism, same idea applied to the genders. If a given gender is not given the same opportunities or isn't treated in some worse way, then we call that sexism. Well, what is it when it's like, okay, if you're a human, we wouldn't think of removing part of your brain, as part of a study, as part of a research study. But if you're an animal, we might. Is this just speciesism? And is this something we need to think at a deeper level than we do? I believe it is. I worry about indoctrination, that students come into universities where the common practice is to do things to animals you wouldn't do to humans. And because it's so common, it just seems okay. It just seems fine. It just seems right. Everybody's doing it. And so that's called indoctrination. And sometimes people will then follow that lead without thinking about it deeply. I really would love to push people to think about it deeply. And I like to highlight a few things about animal research. I mean, the first question I always give people is this. Why? I mean, when we're talking about being ethical towards something, and we're talking about pain and suffering, what is it that humans possess but animals lack that means we have to treat humans with respect but not animals? There must be something that humans have done to deserve a higher ethical standard. Is it just that they're in our club? We are human, they are human. When you start thinking about this, you run into trouble, right? You could start to say, well, yeah, it's because animals aren't as smart as humans. Well, there's some pretty dumb humans. especially at certain times of their lives. There's times when humans aren't very smart at all. Is it okay to do research on them then? Is it okay to do research on dumb humans? Well, no. We wouldn't do some of this nasty stuff on any human. Well, it's okay to do research. I'm talking about more intrusive research, of course. So there's also a bunch of inconsistencies of logic when it comes to this. So, for example, when researchers are doing animal research, let's say they're trying to cure some human disease by doing animal research, they assume that animals are similar enough to humans so that anything we discover with the animals will have value for the humans. You'll see that this is it's not clear that this is true at all. But this is the idea, and so we're going to study drugs or we're going to do whatever in animals first, because what we learn from animals we can apply to humans. So that implies that there's a commonality of humans and animals. Oh, but not too much of a commonality, because we also want to believe that humans are different enough from animals that it's ethically okay to do things to them that we would consider unethical if done to animals. So we're kind of having our cake and eat it too. We're saying, oh, they're different enough that it's okay to do this, but they're similar enough that we can learn from doing that. Okay. I mean, these two things seem sort of inconsistent with each other to me. And in fact, if you look at that first claim, so these are what's called an appeal to authority, and I don't want to suggest that just because certain people believe what I believe that that's the right way to believe. Certainly not. But it's who these people are that I think is worth thinking about, just to say, well, should I decide what I believe? And that's what I would recommend to all of you guys when it comes to animal research. Especially if you're going to get into it, if you're interested in neuroscience, take some time to know how you feel ethically. So here are some examples. Former director of NIH, Christopher Austin. Traditional animal testing is expensive, time-consuming, uses a lot of animals, and from a scientific perspective, the results do not necessarily translate to humans. A theme you'll see often. Typically, animal research does not inform human research all that well. Mice are mice, and people are people. If we look to the mouse to model every aspect of the disease for man and to model cures, we're just wasting our time. Clifton Berry, chief of the tuberculosis research section of the National Institute of Allergy or whatever. Okay, so history of cancer research has been a history of curing cancer in the mouse. We have cured mice of cancer for decades, and it simply didn't work in humans. Richard Klossner, former director of the National Cancer Institute. 9 out of 10 experimental drugs fail in clinical studies because we cannot accurately predict how they will behave in people based on laboratory and animal studies. Former secretary for U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We've moved away from studying human disease in humans. We all drank the Kool-Aid on that one, me included. The problem is that testing on animals hasn't worked, and it's time to stop dancing around the problem. We need to refocus and adapt new methodologies. Elias Zerhouni, former director of NIH. Researchers are so ingrained in trying to cure mice that they forget we're trying to cure humans. Just a lot of people who have been around this sort of research and that are stating what is often shown in the literature, that this animal research we do isn't really translating to humans. And, if there's not a good justification in the first place, should we be doing this? I'm of the opinion of not. I'm one, I've written a paper about this, happy to share it if you will, but I'm one that believes we need to find a standard that applies to all. So if we wouldn't do something to a human, we shouldn't do it to an animal. So I'm not saying we can't do research on animals, but we should only do to them what we would do to ourselves. We should have that same standard. I don't know of anything that we possess that they lack that makes us worthy of a higher ethical standard. And until there's an answer to that, science is about data. Until we know there's a good reason to be treating them differently, we should not be treating them differently. So I like to throw that out there. I'm not telling you to believe what I believe, but I'm telling you every now and then in life, you're going to run across things where you start to feel like you want to, there's a term I like, kick the hive, where you want to say, hey, I think we all need to be thinking. And when I'm at a university where animal research is happening all around me with many of my colleagues, I worry about indoctrination, right? Do not indoctrinate your children. Don't just tell them, do it this way, it's the right way. Teach them how to think for themselves, how to evaluate evidence, and how to disagree with you. That's what I'm asking you to do. Think for yourselves, evaluate the evidence, and maybe disagree with me. But that's fine. Just don't do things because everyone else is doing them, especially not if there's ethics involved and there's pain and suffering involved. Suffering of animals. Think about it. Okay. Yeah, or how to disagree with society, because that brings this bigger point, which is where I want to leave this. I love phrases like this. If you don't like the world is, you change it. You have an obligation to change it. You just do it one step at a time. So we often hear people saying, I don't like whatever. Cool, that's fine. Now it's up to you to do something about it. I'm a real believer that we all need an activism within us, and our issues can be very different. I might be about animal research. You might be about making sure young girls in various parts of the world are given access to education. There's so many good issues. But if there's something you really don't like in the world, become an agent of change. And to do that, by the way, you need to be a good critical thinker. You got to see the problem and be able to understand it well. You need to be a good creative thinker. You got to see solutions. You need to be a good communicator. You need to be able to present your perspective well in a powerful way. Those skills we're going to work on all through this course. And it's because I think those skills are absolutely critical to this practice, changing the world. And I believe we need, my biggest superpower as a professor is the ability to influence some of you, and through you to impact the world. And I get to teach large classes, so there's a lot of opportunity there. And so that's what I would love to do, is to motivate you guys to give a damn, to find things you don't like, and to become agents of change, and then to give you the skills you need to do that effectively. That's what makes me so proud when I see students out there doing stuff that matters. So cool. Let's leave it there then. I'll let you think about all of that, and I will see you at the next lecture. Okay, bye-bye.